This is a revised version of a DVD first issued on VHS in 1990 called Pacific Voyage. It follows P O and Orient Line ships crossing the Pacific on voyages from Sydney to Manila, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yokohama, Vancouver, San Francisco, Long Beach, Honolulu, Suva, Auckland, and back to Sydney. We're leaving Sydney on a voyage around the Pacific. The photographs are taken from various different Orient Line and P O steamers. Here you see us leaving the pier at Pyrmont. As the ship pulls out from the pier, you can see various other liners and cargo ships in the harbour. BI, P&O, Shore Saddle. Here the harbour bridge. From the harbour bridge you can see Circular Quay and a ferry heading out towards Cremorne. A Manly ferry comes in around the point. Beyond this, the Sydney Opera House has since been built. Now Oronsay. Oronsay, built by Vickers and Armstrong in 1951. 28,000 tons and more. Now passes under Sydney Harbour Bridge on our way up the Pacific. Some of the sightseers come out on the ferry. A freighter follows Oronsay under the bridge. A Manly ferry passes. And those wishing to get a last glimpse of their friends and relatives come out on another ferry specially chartered for the occasion. We pass Garden Island. Tied up there is HMAS Sydney. A light fleet carrier of the 1940 vintage. Out in the harbour we pass another Manly ferry inward bound to Circular Quay. She's pitching and tossing in a light swell. We drop our pilot. And head out towards the Sydney Heads, North Head, beyond here, South Head. Once outside into the open sea, we pitch and toss as Oronsay heads north towards Singapore. Soon we'll be in calmer waters. When we're at sea, we have to have fire drills regularly. And here you see one on the decks of Iberia.
Iberia was built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast in 1954 for the P O, something over 27,000 tons. Passing at sea, a P O cargo ship, either Salsette or Salmara. We were aboard Iberia a minute ago, but now we see her at sea from another vessel. At last we have arrived in Singapore, where people are massing on the quayside to greet the ship, and the welcome ceremonies include a traditional lion dance, where two men perform a dance inside the ceremonial skin of a Chinese lion. Another one has arrived upon the scene to join in the performance. A tour around Singapore, you go up the river into an area which has completely changed since those days of the 1950s and early 60s. Let's see again on board Iberia. She's making rather heavy weather, pitching, looking aft along the boat deck. The officers on the bridge are watching for a pilot boat to come alongside. The captain on his bridge wing and the second officer signalling the pilot boat to come around to the other side. Ashore in Manila, you can hire a jeep to explore the areas around the city.
One of the main attractions in Manila, if you had the feeling for it, was the cockfighting, something I didn't particularly like to watch. It's a particularly nasty sport, if you can call it a sport. But sadly it attracts the tourists and is very popular, or was at that time, amongst the local population. Let's hope it's been banned now. But back at sea, there are a number of attractions on the decks of the ship, and here we see deck tennis, paddle tennis as it was, being played on the decks, a deck of Orcades. Here's a shot of Orcades herself steaming away through the Pacific as it heads upwards north towards Hong Kong and beyond. By now we're in tropical weather and it's nice to cool off from time to time. Here's shots of Oronsays after decks in the swimming pools. And these were shot on Orion, which has swimming pools for first class and for tourist class passengers. One of the loveliest things about being at sea were the sunsets. This is a magnificent sunset filmed from the decks of Oronsay by Chris Hurtwood, who has contributed tremendously towards our collection. The other films are from Carola Ingle and Joe Clark, and on this sequence I think we have some films from Mike Whittingham of Birmingham. Here we see Hong Kong in the dark And now we've arrived and the junks are in the harbour. These are lovely shots of Hong Kong in the early 50s. Here's Orcades steaming into the harbour. She'll shortly tie up alongside Iberia, which we'll see later on. In the meantime, I'll just have a look round the harbour, taken from the decks of Orcades. In the mid-50s and early 60s, they were still building a number of the high-rise flats which now house a large part of the population. In these days, a lot of people had to live on their little boats and junks, and you'll see that in scenes that are following. That's the Star Ferry terminus. You see a ship slipping down behind the terminus towards the sea.
Most of the liners tied up on the quays in Kowloon, which is actually on the mainland opposite the island of Hong Kong. This is Iberia in Kowloon. Being in Hong Kong gives you a wonderful chance to go ashore and buy all kinds of wonderful goods, from photographic and electrical things to silks and handicrafts, to take photographs in the crowded streets.
A trip to the top of the peak, or a suit made in 48 hours. There are all sorts of attractions.
One of them being a trip to the other side of Hong Kong Island and Aberdeen, where there are, in those days, 2 floating restaurants. You could be rowed across in a sampan and choose your own fish from a tank. I was always rather squeamish about that. A junk leaves in the evening from Aberdeen, and a sampan comes back across the harbour.
It seems to be raining at this stage.
The humidity in Hong Kong is very high indeed, and if you live there, all your shoes and the covers of your books turn green in no time. You can just see one of the floating restaurants across there in the background. One of the many dogs that live on the Chinese vessels in the harbour. Green hills of Hong Kong, more and more covered by high-rise blocks of flats. Expensive flats and cheap flats where whole families live in one room. These are all shots of Aberdeen, the fishing harbour. Chusan at the Kowloon Quays is preparing to sail, and the streamers are being thrown from the ship to the people waiting on the shore, and the officers are waving to their friends. People look down from the bridge wing to make sure that all is well as the ship casts off. Off-duty officers from the purser's staff are waving to a friend on the quay. And the last gangway has been taken away. Someone looks out from a porthole, and the ship is pulled slowly at stern, away from her berth. Chusan makes some smoke, some very dense smoke in this picture, as she sails away from Hong Kong down the harbour. A majestic sight, a wonderful ship.
Leaving the harbour and gathering pace, we head out towards Japan. It's not always tranquil in these waters, and here we've hit a typhoon in Yokohama Bay. We'll steam backwards and forwards for an hour or two before it's calm enough to get into the harbour. In the meantime, you can join me going up and down and up and down again, and from side to side as the winds lash the promenade deck, A deck, and the rain sweeps across towards the funnel. But for the seasick, there are many more tranquil scenes ahead. We'll shortly be arriving in Yokohama. The first glimpse is of Mount Fuji as we head towards the harbour entrance. Ashore now, and there are many things to attract the camera, little people particularly. A street seller, a lady posing in a kimono, while her husband or boyfriend in European dress is taking her photograph. We now head out towards Kyoto by train. Many of these rural scenes are no longer around. Look at this, for instance, kimonos laid out on the shore of a river to dry. Whilst others are being rinsed in this fast-flowing stream. How about this for a spin dryer? And a rinser? Here we are in Kyoto, in one of the many tranquil parks. Kyoto was the ancient capital of Japan. Golden Pavilion.
Back in the busy streets, you can see local transport of the time and people in traditional Japanese clothes looking across the lake at Hakone towards Mount Fuji. Here's a street procession in order of some celebration, I don't know what. And finally, as we leave Japan, we're played away from the quayside by the Yokohama Firemen's Band. As always, the streamers are there. This was a tradition at the time.
We're now in Vancouver Harbour. That was the Seattle ferry, which you can see here in the distance. There are a number of floats in the harbour, and I never did find out quite what they were for. But there was time to go ashore and visit the Rockies. Here there are magnificent scenes. This is Capilano Canyon, and you'll see in a moment the sun setting over the scenery. It's absolutely beautiful. We move on and leave Vancouver under the Lionsgate Bridge and head towards San Francisco.
A few hours down the coast and we have arrived in San Francisco, showing the Embarcadero, which is the name of the dockland area of the city. Two great bridges span San Francisco Bay. This is the Oakland Bay Bridge, which has a halfway point on Treasure Island, a US Navy base, and in the distance, Oakland. As we pass Telegraph Hill with the Coit Tower on it, with the eyes of these days, we're struck by how much the city has changed since then, with many, many more high-rise buildings. As we sail in, Stars and Stripes is hoisted on board the Iberia. The second officer on the forecastle is at his station for entering port. Once in San Francisco, there's an opportunity to drive across the famous Golden Gate Bridge, erected in 1936. The cars being the very latest of the day, which was the early 1960s. Back in the city, a car drive up and down the steep streets with their level crossing points and the cable cars. It's to be hoped these will always be a San Francisco feature. They're very much loved and well maintained and looked after. Coming down Hyde Street, In the bay, you can see the island of Alcatraz, which at the time was still a prison. This is Lombard Street, a section of which is known as the windiest street in the world, with gardens all down it and the street in sharp bends. Time to leave San Francisco again. And a member of the deck crew is freeing the flag so that it is lowered as we leave American waters. We're sailing out through the Golden Gate, underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. Iberia's mast passes underneath the bridge. And the next port of call is Long Beach. Not far from Long Beach is marine land of the Pacific, where there is an opportunity to go down in a diving bell and look at some of the fantastic fish which are kept in an enormous tank to allow them freedom to swim about as naturally as possible. A huge shark in the background there. Here comes the diving bell, arriving with a great bounce at the surface of the water. It will slowly rise the last part, and a door will be opened for the people to come out who have been viewing what is to be seen at the bottom of the tank. Various other features of marine land include penguins, dolphins performing, a whale and seals. We're driving back now towards Long Beach, seeing the countryside of Southern California.
These are the donkeys, oil wells. But back at sea, we see Arcadia approaching us. Considering that the cameras we used had no telescopic lens, it says a lot for the seamanship of the two captains concerned. The ships pass so close to get these wonderful cinefilms. Shots of Arcadia were filmed from the deck of Orcades. A time to relax or take up some deck games. Here we're on the deck of Chusan with officers playing deck quoits. Some people might call it deck tennis. There's a difference here between the Orient Line and the P O. Diamond Head, Oahu, Honolulu. This welcome was reserved for ships on their maiden voyage, and this is Canberra's maiden voyage. Canberra came into service in 1961 and was over 40,000 tons. She's still afloat at the time of our making this film. Here you see hula hula girls coming up the side of one of the ships as she enters port. They performed on the deck for the passengers. Here a group are performing for first-class passengers on Canberra in the early 1960s, just above the first-class swimming pool. Our technology allows us to revert to Oronsay and the sun deck as we come in towards the lower tower in Honolulu. The passengers are wreathed in leis, divided by the hula hula girls. The smell was something to be believed. Beautiful fragrance. The lower tower, the pier where we will shortly tie up. A job well done, the hula girl departs. Now we see from the lower tower Oronsay, tied up alongside. And we'll take a trip out around the surrounding town.
Honolulu, of course, is near Pearl Harbor, the scene of the dreadful attack on the American Navy in World War II. And this is a statue of King Kamehameha, who is very greatly revered by the local people. A war memorial here.
Having seen the sights, we can now move out to the playground of Oahu, Waikiki Beach, with Diamond Head in the background.
Waikiki Beach, man-made by bringing truckloads of sand and depositing them in the bay. A wonderful place of relaxation and sunshine, fringed by palm trees and luxury hotels. One of which, the Moana Hotel, was kind enough always to make a room available free for P O and Orient Line officers to change and shower after bathing. Scene taken inside the Moana Hotel, looking out on the beach, P&O officers relaxing with famous Mai Tai drinks in front of them.
One of the many pools surrounding the hotels. Luxury indeed. We have to go back towards the harbour and the ship and make our way towards Suva, Fiji.
Wonderful shots at sea taken from the Iberia.
These are the Neptune ceremony on Suva. The scene was reenacted in the tourist class after a performance in the first class. Now we arrive in Suva. Clouds gather and it's bound to rain at some stage during the day, but most of the time it was very hot and steamy and exceptionally green. Just what you'd expect of a tropical island. Some lovely shots of the promenade deck, B deck of Oronsay. A survey vessel. Passengers gathering on the promenade deck to see the ship come into the wharf. We're greeted by the police band, red tunics and white skirts. How's that for a visiting bureau? Here's a lovely shot of Oronsay tied up alongside the quay in Suva. You'll see they use their own accommodation ladders down onto the quay as a way of getting to and from the ship. Traffic policeman directs traffic around fairly empty streets in very relaxed garb. The municipal markets, all sorts of fruit, vegetables, coconuts, flowers, and various other local produce are sold here, close to the quay. In the early days, the captain's tiger used to ride a bicycle to and from the Great Pacific Hotel to the ship, passing messages. Here are some open-air buses carrying the local populace to work, and children jumping for pennies thrown from the ship above. That's the steam packet that plies between Fiji and Auckland. And back at sea, a superb shot of Oronsay from Arcadia's bridge as she steams towards New Zealand. The seaman strikes Arcadia's bell. Should wake the dead.
Arrived in New Zealand, we see the inevitable sheep, but it's not long before we're on our way to Wellington, but we have to wait on board Canberra on the maiden voyage in the Cook Strait, steamed up and down for 52 hours in the worst storm they had known for over 30 years. It wasn't safe to go on deck, even on Canberra's highest deck. Another vessel also waits to go into port until it's safe enough to cross the bar. Although still very rough, it's deemed that the seas have subsided sufficiently for the pilot boat to come out and for the ship safely to enter harbour. I think the pilot must be a man of a very strong stomach to be able to cope with this. Smart, in full uniform, he jumps across from his launch to the ladder and inside the Canberra. And away goes his launch, labouring in the still strong seas.
Back ashore, we're now in Wellington. We take the railway above the harbour.
From the other end of the North Island, you can make a trip from Auckland to Rotorua, which is the place of the famous boiling mud and geysers and the local Maori architecture. That's one of the boiling mud pools. And here you can see the steam rising all around Rotorua. In some of the not quite so hot water in the area, trout are farmed. And here somebody's feeding them with a mixture taken from a bowl on a stick.
Back at sea, we head towards Sydney. It's a chance for the purser's staff and some of the lady officers on the ship to have a bridge visit. You'll see they're in blues as we're heading towards Sydney in the winter. We should like to thank David Pollard, who's assisted us with the technical aspects of our recording, David Clark, who's worked the various apparatus necessary to make these films, Carola Ingle for her commentary and for her film, and many others who have made this film possible. Here we are in Sydney, and we wish you all the best.